The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode. Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
So Jen, tell our listeners what we're talking about today, who our guest is, and all that good stuff.
Okay. So today we're speaking to Nina Simons. Nina is a social entrepreneur whose work centers around women's leadership, restoring the feminine, and co-creating a healthy and equitable world for all. She's a co-founder of Bioneers, which is a nonprofit that she co-founded with her husband, Kenny Ausubel, with a mission to platform common sense solutions to social and ecological challenges with a whole system approach.
Yes, Nina also serves on multiple national boards, and in 2017, she and Kenny were the recipients of the Goi Peace Award. And I'd like to point out that other recipients of the Goi Award include Bill Gates, James Lovelock, and Deepak Chopra.
Today, we're speaking with Nina about her latest book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred: A Woman Listens for Leadership. This book was a winner of the Nautilus Gold Award for Women in the 21st Century and the Nautilus Silver Award for Social Change and Social Justice.
I think all you have to do is mention the title of the book and know that Jennifer and I were in. It's all about balancing our masculine and feminine sides, embracing multicultural female leadership, and the intricate ways that the environmental challenges we're facing can be traced back to this fundamental imbalance.
It's so fascinating, and Nina is so lovely. So with that, let's get to the interview. Nina, we are so excited to have you with us today. We've been talking about you forever behind the scenes, Monica and myself, and we're so thrilled that you're joining us today on the podcast.
Well, I'm really excited to be here with you, and I'm so curious about what you're talking about.
It's all good. We promise it's all good, but we've been diving into your work for so long and your book, which we're going to get to, but we're just so appreciative that you took the time today to be with us.
Well, and Nina, we feel like your work is inspiring our work, all of the work you've been doing about really bringing, not only reconnecting people with nature and the land, but really focusing on women and sort of that feminine journey. And so we're so excited about that. And we see you as 100% inspiration for the work that we're trying to do to connect people in a biophilic way back to nature. So would love to sort of just like kick it off by a little bit of your background. You've had a really storied career, but I guess one question I'm always curious is, what was your relationship with nature as a child? And did that lead you towards your current path of really trying to reinform our relationship with the land?
Well, it was a windy path. It's been a windy path. You know, as a child, I grew up in New York City, but I was always a block and a half from Central Park. And our parents took us upstate to the Catskill Mountains every weekend. And I learned very early on in my life, I think, that nature was where I went for solace. Nature was a source of peace for me. And whenever something was emotionally disturbing or turbulent for me, I went into nature. And when I was then in high school and college, I actually fell in love with theater because I knew that our culture was not working in a way that was creating a viable future. I even knew that then, that there was so much deception and false separation. And I thought that this embodied performance art was a way to really reach people's hearts and minds and get them to question their value systems. But when I realized how difficult it might be to earn a living at what I called transformational theater, I went off and did other things. I did a lot of spiritual work, and I managed restaurants, and everything that I've done actually feels like it's fed into my current life manifestation, which keeps evolving. But I realized many years later that with Bioneers, I have my childhood dream of creating transformational theater. And that was incredibly happy making. So there were events along the way that brought me back into serving nature as source. And I think my parents were assimilating Jews. And because of that, I grew up without any religious orientation, but with a cultural sense of an obligation to leave the world a better place than when I find it. And I think that as I experienced biodiversity in gardens and wildness in nature and the power of relationship to the land and to natural systems, I found that that was my spiritual source. And so I'm getting ready to teach a course on sacred activism. And so I've been thinking a lot about what has prompted all my major decisions in my life. And I think it's really that I consider nature to be sacred. For me, that's where the divine resides. And so that's informed a lot of my life.
Oh my gosh, Nina, you're definitely speaking our language 100%. Everything you just said is so in line with what Monica and I always talk about and think about. And I, especially to think of nature as this divineness and this beauty to learn from and to uphold as well. And I think, and I get you too, because I'm now in my New York City apartment and 2 blocks from Central Park and love going to the Catskills as often as possible. But I would love to share, because we know your work at the Bioneers. Can you describe a little more about your work, the nonprofit Bioneers, and how you formed that and why you did?
Sure. Well, it was originally really the brainchild of my husband and partner, Kenny Ausubel. And we were both social entrepreneurs working to develop a company called Seeds of Change that was all about reintroducing biodiversity back into the food system by engaging with a huge community of backyard gardeners. And he was doing a lot of research at the time about natural solutions for detoxifying the environment, air and soil and water. And he was discovering that there were amazing innovators out there that were learning from nature how to heal nature. And one day he was bemoaning to a friend in a hot tub that he was discovering these amazing people and no one had ever heard of them. And the friend said, "Why don't you have a conference?" And Kenny said, "Well, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that?" And the friend said, "Here's a grant. Go have a conference." And so Kenny came to me, and he knew of my theater background, and he said, "Will you help me produce a conference?" And we started Bioneers in 1990, partly in response to James Hansen sounding the alarm about climate change. And that was, I think, the year when Time magazine had the Earth on its cover, as the planet of the year. And we had this conference, and I applied everything that I had learned, both from my spiritual work and my theater work, and found that I found myself sitting there during the conference with my mouth hanging open in wonder, because the people who were speaking were amazing to me and so inspiring. And I thought, this is where I want to bring my communication skills. And so over the years, Bioneers has developed and evolved. There's always been an annual conference that's a face-to-face live event that attracts about 2,500 to 3,000 people a year. And over the recent years, we've evolved it really into a media company. So We produce a radio series and podcasts that win awards every year. And we have a ton of videos on YouTube, and our website has enormous traffic. And we're also on cable TV. And we just launched a new project that's called Bioneers Learning, where we're actually featuring trainings for hands-on skills that are both in terms of behavior and what can you do to organize or mobilize in your local community, but also emphasizing the connection with the inner work that we need to do to be able to bring ourselves most fully to this time. So that's sort of a snapshot. The one thing I haven't said that's important to note is that Bioneers has always had an Indigenous worldview at its heart. And this past year, we had our first conference in Berkeley, and we actually had people from 125 sovereign nations come to the conference, because the indigeneity program has developed over the years such a strong reputation and community that it's a beautiful space. So that's a part of our biophilia as well.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you bring up that the inner self, the work that we do inside is just as important. And I wonder if you have, I know I want to talk about your book because I think that's a wonderful tool and guide for the inner self. But do you have some sort of high level whys or hows we can get to that inner work? Obviously globally, but I think as a country, the United States, our leaders need to do that inner work. Because if we don't have that and can't connect to that inside, I think it's very difficult for people to actually see the sacred in the land. And I really loved that sacred activism. Everybody's driven by other goals. And I think once you do the inner work, you can sort of shift your purpose. What are your thoughts, high level, of how do we get everybody on board? That's a big question.
Well, it's such a good question. And for me, part of what happened was that I had this big awakening in my early 30s about the role of gender in informing our cultures and our societies. And what I realized then was that not only had my own gender really influenced my sense of possibilities for myself, but what happened was that a friend turned me on to a film that's online called The Burning Times. And it's a film that was made in the early 90s by Canadian filmmakers. And it's a little dated, but it tells the profound and incredibly important story of the 200 to 300 year period in European history, where somewhere between 50,000 and several million women were systematically persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And when I saw that, I had all these revelations. I realized it was the first time that I understood why speaking my truth in public was so scary for me. I also wondered, why on earth had I not learned this in school? Because it's such a major event in human history. And it prompted me to do a lot of research, Monica. And what I found was that major system shifts happened during the course of the Burning Times that affected everything in the civilization. And so the first people to be persecuted were the healers and the midwives and the herbalists, right? And so by the end of the Burning Times, only men were allowed to practice medicine. And you had to go to medical school, and only men were allowed to go to medical school. So medicine became the purview of the masculine in a certain way. The whole realm of connecting to the sacred and the spiritual went from a direct embodied experience that was happening, that people were having in a kind of pagan way, to a mediated relationship that the church had to do, right? And so there was this interruption and this false separation. There was a huge economic shift that happened during the Burning Times, where at the beginning of the Burning Times, women actually had control of far more wealth in Europe. And by the end of the Burning Times, there was a huge transfer of wealth. And the last thing I would name is that there was a change in our relationship to the land, because at the beginning of the burning times, land was held in commons. And by the end of the burning times, there was the enclosure movement and land became privatized. So that's a long way of getting to the answer to your question. But what I found as I did all that research was that it wasn't only that we've inherited huge cultural and societal biases about women, but also about everything associated with the quote feminine. And that includes our bodies and embodied experience and our emotions and our spirituality or relationship to the sacred. So I actually believe that the climate crisis is partially, or perhaps entirely, informed by that imbalance that we've inherited over generations and generations. And science has now proven that intergenerational trauma is real, and that, what I know is that different iterations of the burning times happened all over the world. And it helps me understand why patriarchal systems are so entrenched. So as we look at the environmental and existential crises we're facing, one way of seeing them is that they're a manifestation of that imbalance. And that in order to invite and invoke that reconnection to the sacred, we need to rebalance ourselves regardless of what gendered body we might happen to be in at this moment. And so really, I think the interesting challenge is to make shifting that balance as attractive to men as it is to women. And really, we're all redefining the masculine and the feminine all the time because we've inherited such messed up definitions of them. And so really, I think we're all on a long trajectory of learning to become the best humans we know how to be.
Wow, Nina, that is really beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm so taken back by everything you just said, because I'm just thinking, yes, everything is so in line with, it's just self-destruction and planetary destruction, because there is this imbalance, and people are so fearful of finding their spiritual self and their soul self through the land. Like, it was almost like you were embarrassed to be a spiritual human being. And I found that hard, because I always felt I've, in the space of being spiritual myself, have been quiet about things because, the systems, like you say, kind of push you down, or you're not worthy. It has to be about capitalism. It has to be about buying and selling and creating this imbalance of the norm of what we really should be focusing on, which is this sovereignty of love and beauty and grace that we all have, and we all embody that. Fascinating, really fascinating.
One of my favorite sort of pole star quotes comes from Fritjof Capra, who says the shift to an eco-literate society, it requires a shift from a focus on counting things to a focus on mapping relationship. Right? And he says, we don't have any trainings in how to map and deepen relationship. And I think that's our greatest challenge, in a sense, and our greatest calling right now, not only to the land, but to each other and to ourselves, and across race, across class, across age, across everything that falsely is being used to divide us.
Yes, I agree. And I think so much that's happened over this sort of huge shift during COVID and the pandemic, so much happened over that period. And in the political sphere, that it exactly mirrors that everybody's trying to divide us. Everybody's trying to find a wedge issue. It's very combative versus conversational. Like, nobody wants to have a conversation. We just want to yell at each other through social media. And I think so much of the finding the inner is seeking the other, that understanding the other and the differences, and not using those as wedges, but using them as the beauty of diversity, right? I mean, you look at the landscape, and the beauty of nature is just diversity. So tell me a little bit about the book. So the book is Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. But as you said, I think it is not just for women. I think it's a beautiful way for men to think about connecting with their, she. But it sounds like your worldview and the sort of journey you had was the inspiration. It sounds like you've touched on some of the larger themes in it, but tell me, how have people received the book, and tell me how you're utilizing it?
Well, here's how the book came about, which is that every year I've had the opportunity to write a short talk for Bioneers. And it's always feels like a huge responsibility because I'm going to take up space on this stage with all these luminaries. I always feel, really, I feel very humble, and I feel like a relative newbie as a writer. But each year I wrote these talks and people have responded very powerfully to them. And so the initial impetus for the book was to bring together talks that I've written that describe the arc of my own journey, really, which is not only my own journey, but as it relates to all of the issues we all care about and our relationship to the earth and to the future of humanity and our survival. So I brought together all those essays, and then I kind of organized them, and I realized that nature, culture, and the sacred are really the pillars of what has informed my life. And at the same time as doing Bioneers, I've also had this other sort of branch of my tree that has been convening diverse women leaders over 20 or 25 years to explore leadership from the inside out, to see how we can find common cause and really build relationship with each other across those differences. And so the book came about because it's the combination of all these essays with discussion guides and embodied practices that really were gleaned from all those years of convening women and learning from and with them what works to create connective tissue, what works to ignite ahas within ourselves, because we all learn best from our own ahas, of course. And what's been really exciting, Monica, is that I've learned from educators that are using it in their classrooms, in high school and college, and even in graduate school. And then I've been contacted by women who are using them in women's circles. And I love that. And one of my favorite reviews on Amazon was from a father, a man who said, "This book has been so helpful to me in that I'm understanding more deeply my wife and my daughters." And I thought, oh boy, that's a home run for me. So it's being used in all kinds of ways. And I'm so honored to get it out in the world, frankly. It feels like a very rich offering from a lot of years of hard-earned learning.
And I love, there's one area called like the power of story, because you even said like you're afraid to speak your truth in public. And why are we so afraid to speak our truth? So it's interesting that you kind of bring that up in the book as well, that power of story, because we all have that story. And especially as women, that we come together in that space of vulnerability, but also that support system, which is so very divine and beautiful.
It's true. And I love that section because it gave me an opportunity to lift up women leaders who are my inspiration and talk about why I love them. And so it's, I do believe that leadership itself is changing and that we all need to embrace more collaborative styles and greater humility in our leadership and greater vulnerability.
I think that is something that I and Jen, and just even the two of us doing this podcast together, it's like our relationship is about like together, not competition, and lifting each other up. And I think that's so much what this book is about, is that illuminating women, lifting women up, and again, lifting all leaders up, but with the history that we're talking about, sort of this years of pulling women out of power and out of places of influence, that how can we as women not take that combative, aggressive stance of competition, but really as empowerment together. And I think that comes through so beautifully in this book. So I don't know if I really have a question, but maybe more of a compliment. So.
Oh, thank you. That's beautiful. And what I feel inspired to share is that I just heard a podcast yesterday from a woman who I had invited to come speak at Bioneers last year. And at the last minute, she got COVID. And I would highly recommend you Gaias look into her because she's amazing. And her name is Kriti Kenko. And listeners can look her up. And she is both a climate scientist who works with Environmental Defense Fund and also a Zen Dharma teacher. And and her analysis of where we are and what we need to do to get through it is so deeply congruent with my own. And part of what she talks about, which I really wanted to name here, is that as a woman who has inherited the privileges of white skin in this country, it's been really important to me to learn about how to be an anti-racist and a good ally to people of color and Indigenous people. And so many of my mentors have been those people. And so I've been on a steep learning curve about that for a long time. And one of the things that Kriti talks about is she says that the climate crisis is actually a direct result of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy cultures. And I would add of patriarchal cultures as well. And that when you look at that being the root of the climate crisis, she says we simply cannot address climate without concurrently addressing all those other issues. You know, there are people who say, well, we have to fix the climate crisis first, and then we'll deal with the social issues. But we can't, because if Bioneers has taught me one thing, it's how to understand what we're going through from a whole systems perspective. And it's a beautiful poem that my husband wrote for Bioneers, which is, it's all connected, it's all alive, it's all intelligent, it's all relatives. And I think that's what we're really facing into right now.
And I think that's a great point. And it's fear, and some of that fear goes into hoarding of whatever that might be, power, money, land, that then results in these things. And how can we flip it? And even the conversation we're having, people can be fearful of that because it's different, right? And so how do we bring people in that it's not hippy dippy, it's not airy fairy, it's not this, spirituality is an accessible thing and it's not against anything, that we should be open. And I find that is the hardest thing, is trying to find a way for people to come in without fear or without a closed mind. And that's another thing, I think your book does, is it just really lays it out in a very warm, friendly way. And we just need more of that. We need more embracing of where we're going and bridging. And I think that the world is getting there, right? We see these cultural trends, if even yoga, or even people understanding maybe what Zen Dharma is, or people embracing Buddhism, or even having conversations about collectivism, the commons. It's all about education, really, is where it starts, right?
And you know what, Monica, to that point, what you're talking about, Nina and Monica, it's like everything's been so siloed. So everything we've ever done or being told to do is in a silo, and you cannot get out of that silo. So if you tip your toe into something else, then you're fearful of that conversation or what people will think of you. So I think that's interesting that you're bringing that up, Monica, because of Nina's work. But that's exactly, I feel like everything's been so garnered in a space that you have to be in, and you're going to stay in that forever. And God forbid, you want to learn something different or new. And then you almost come off as like this weird person that wants to learn and continuously learn and evolve. And I think, like you said, Monica, too, like we're hopefully coming out of the space of people being more receptive to evolving as humans.
Well, really, I hope I'm learning till the day I die and growing and changing, and I have a lot of humility about that. And I think a practice of humility is really important these days. But the other thing I was going to say is, I think part of what we are doing to help make these ideas more accessible is we're embodying them. And what I see in both of you is, you're not afraid to talk about this stuff, and you're both really highly intelligent and perceptive and analytical, and you make good connections. And we've inherited this notion that women are these emotional basket cases who are like all about looks and being sexy. And guess what? In the meantime, what we're finding is that all of the global studies are proving that grassroots women are having the greatest impacts on climate, and that grassroots women globally are receiving 2% of the climate change funding that's going out there. So we have this incredible disconnect between the truth of women as peacemakers, women as climate change activists, women as educators, all these things, and this deeply ingrained bias. And in many ways, I think what we have to do is develop trauma-informed strategies, because in many ways, I have come to believe that we're all traumatized. I mean, the numbers are kind of staggering when you think about it. The fact that 1 in 3 women globally will have experienced some form of violence or domestic violence in her lifetime, that I think 1 in 4 people has somebody who's either alcoholic or drug addicted in their families. 1 in 5 people in the US has experienced violence to their bodies so that they have physical harm from it. And what science again has proven with epigenetic trauma is that we carry the traumas of our ancestors. And who among us has ancestors who are traumatized? I mean, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your class or education or where you came from, we all have traumatized ancestors. So, and I think the combination of the pandemic and the ecological crises are creating such an undercurrent of unexpressed grief among people.
Yes.
I think part of what we have to do is really educate ourselves about our own trauma and how to meet people where they are and have strategies that really take into account what you mentioned, Monica, about people's fearfulness about change, but also that they're coming from a traumatized place, which tends to make people respond with a fight or flight response.
Yes. Well, and somebody said, maybe Jen, you and I are having this conversation, but social media or the news, or you're always heightened, right? You're at this cortisol level, like you are in this forever fight or flight response, because it's like bad news, bad news, bad news, Twitter fighting, whatever, the whole thing, this person has a prettier house. Oh my God. It's just this, you're heightened and you just can't sit in that world all the time. And so part of it is, we'll all day long, we'll say, get out in nature, right? But it's like, get off the screens, stop listening to the news. So many of these things are here to divide us, and think of them as tools. Like we all use technology. It's not going anywhere, but how can we use it for the positive, for educational, for connecting in good ways, rather than this. You just can't sit there with the cortisol. It diminishes your body in your mental capacities over time. So I don't know if anybody's studying that, but something's got to be going on there that we don't even recognize, to your point, that this unexpressed grief. But if we don't talk about it and start to think about what are some of those solutions, we're never going to get anywhere. So
I think that's so true, Monica. And also we have this inherited bias about productivity. And about always being in action, right?
Yes.
And having a long to-do list, and you're only as good as how many things you accomplished. And in fact, right? And in fact, what I've learned is the feminine in all of us thrives in spaciousness. It's part of why a sitting meditation has become so valuable to me every day. And even if it's just 2 or 3 minutes of just getting still and breathing deeply and going inside and closing your eyes and checking in with how you're feeling, because we are part of nature, of course, and not apart from her. And really, if we listen deeply to what our inner guidance tells us, that's probably the best source of instruction we could get. And it stabilizes us from exactly all that heightened stuff.
That's so true. Oh my gosh, Nina, I'm getting goosebumps right now. I'm feeling all that because what you said, Monica, about this, we're not talking about the grief. We're not talking about the trauma. And especially since COVID and everyone's afraid, again, tiptoeing around the obvious without wanting to hurt someone or say, I'm hurting or I'm scared or it's been really hard, or these little things that people have been traumatized about and they're afraid to talk about it. But there's always this like elephant in this room. And I feel it very deeply, especially in New York City. There's a giant elephant in the room that no one's talking about. And it is this carried grief from COVID. Everyone's supposed to just pick up and hustle your way back to the way things were. And I see that every day being here. And I have to so I got rid of the news. I got rid of my TV during COVID, but I feel this uneasiness and this pressure. So I'm glad you're talking about that, Nina, because I really feel so deeply about that work that needs to be done to sit in the stillness and to listen to your body quietly in a space that brings you joy and stillness. And it's hard, but it's important work. The great listening is really in that space of silence and deep peace.
I remain convinced that were we able to have public grief rituals that were accepted, where everyone could go and just be with what they're sorrowing about,
wow,
we would diminish the amount of violence in this country overnight.
Wow. That is fascinating. Yeah. It's a really interesting idea, but I like that. That's a big idea. Have you been, I'm sure you've had the conversations with people. Is that something that what does that look like?
Well, we have hosted a grief ritual space at our annual conference for the past several years. And people are often very timid about going in there. And once they go in, the women who host it are fantastic. And they create a beautiful space that's clearly very different from the outside world. And they don't push anybody, and there's no pressure, and you don't have to express. You can just sit there. But I think what happens is having a space where grief is acknowledged and honored just gives everyone permission to feel it. And that's half the battle right there. There are beautiful stories of folks who come in and say, my best friend was shot a couple of weeks ago, and this is the first chance I've had to really process it and feel it. And that's crazy stuff. There's so many of us living with unexpressed sorrow.
Yeah, just in the day-to-day. It's so true. And I think, again, it goes back to fear, right? I don't want to break down in front of anybody. I don't want to look weak. I don't want to show emotion.
Yep.
And wherever that cultural came from, whether that was, be more stoic or, don't be this, don't be that. We're told to do all these different things, and instead of truly like connecting with ourselves. And I think that's a fascinating idea. And you wonder, just like, again, I kind of referenced yoga before, where yoga and meditation have become more mainstream. And I think meditation, if we could really get people into meditation, I think that would have profound impacts on the world, or the US especially. But that is true. It's like, if you make grief, or even talking about death, a more common topic that we're not fearful of, then it opens up that space for people. But it does take time. And again, back to that education, which one of the questions I was curious about is, we've talked a lot about this imbalance between masculine and feminine and energy in the world. Do you find that there are a lot of men that are coming in more and more as allies? And do you feel like, where do we start with some of they always talk about more women in politics, more women on corporate boards, more women in those worlds, but in leadership really. But we get in trouble if we're too soft and too emotional. And then we get in trouble if we're AOC, right? Then we're too this. Where's that middle ground?
I don't know if there is a middle ground per se, but really, what I would say, honestly, Monica, is that part of my advocacy is for what I call full spectrum leadership, which means, how do we embrace all the parts of our humanity? And we stop naming things as feminine or masculine.
Yes.
Because that bias is so deeply ingrained.
God, you're right. Yes.
But how do we recognize that we have emotions for a reason? Nature gave us emotions for good reason. And how do we help heal our relationship inwardly with our emotions so that we don't have to stuff them under the rug when they come up, right? And how do we recognize that leadership itself has to be more vulnerable, more willing to take risks, and more receptive to not knowing all the answers, to a model that is not macho. There's a brilliant study that was done globally that's called the Athena Doctrine. And they studied 13 nations and millions of people around the world. And what they found was that fully 67% of the people that they surveyed said the world would be a better, healthier place if people led more like women.
Wow.
Right?
That's profound.
So there's a way in which we know this, and we need to just take off the labels and the stigmatism and say, here is the new model. We're all evolving into our best humanity. How do we do that together? How do we do that in a way that has kindness and forgiveness for the mistakes we'll make and is open to not knowing and to vulnerability, to all those things? Because that's what creates great teams and collaborations. And that's what we need to get through this.
Yeah, that's so true.
Your book is definitely that guide to that too. I feel like this book is this kind of awakening of understanding. Do you feel like this shift happening? Like, are you seeing a shift of awareness and understanding, like more so than you have because you've been doing this for so long? Are you hopeful for the future of what you're seeing with this book and what you're seeing around you?
I'm hopeful because I'm a movement scanner. And there is so much incredible work being done at the grassroots and mobilizing and in think tanks and in the progressive world. And I think there is a generational shift that we're living through. And I think young people have a much healthier, many of them have a much healthier relationship to gender than those people my age. And I think, there's an old saying that science changes one funeral at a time. And I think
like that.
Right. And
yes,
but we can't really wait that long right now. So I'm most hopeful about the movement building that's happening among people of color, among Indigenous people, among young people, and among white allies with all of those groups. And I think that my favorite imagining is that all of those groups who are in many ways advocating for elements of the same vision could create the connective tissue to be able to act as one body, because we are the majority and we have enormous power if only we can overcome the false separations that are being so grossly manipulated right now.
Wow.
Nina.
That's where my hope lies.
Wow. That's Nina's mic drop right there.
That was a profound ending. And I will champion the different guides and prompts for deeper learning in the book, which are wonderful. We'll link everything in the show notes, but please, people dig in. I think just even you do a few of them, they're really, really empowering. So, well, Nina, I don't know if there's anything that you want to end on, but that was beautiful. I don't think we need anything else, but where can we find you? Should we follow you on socials when we're not out in nature?
You can follow me on socials, but really through Bioneers and through Bioneers project called Bioneers Learning. I'm going to be teaching an online course on sacred activism.
Okay.
Oh, fantastic.
Sometime over the winter, I'm going to be teaching an online course based on this book.
Oh, wow.
So there's more to come. Yeah. So
I have loved this book, Nina.
Oh,
yeah, I know. This book is bed next to bed. It's a beautiful, beautiful read. And like what Monica said, just everyone should really just pick up a copy and highlight and share. And I mean, I have so many notes throughout this book, Nina.
Dog-eared and pencil. So much stuff. So
yeah, I know. Well, Nina, thank you so much for your time and your grace and your wisdom, because this has been such a gift to be with you. And I wish we had more time, but we're so thankful that you joined us today.
Well, this was really rich.
All I can say is that was absolutely amazing. I feel so inspired, and I can't wait for us to dive into the learning guide together.
I know. And I love that she has this discussion guide. I've been flipping through it and it's really comprehensive. I'd highly recommend the book for a book club, even for the classroom. It could be a really useful, interesting tool.
So Monica, what were some of the big takeaways from Nina for you?
I've been thinking a lot about the fundamental imbalance that Nina talked about and how we can trace it back to so many modern problems today. In our modern culture, especially in this country, we really value individualism and sort of this, aggressive, constant productivity, which are traditionally very masculine attributes. But we valued these things so highly that we've sort of devalued attributes like collaboration and caregiving, which she quotes as a more feminine idea by default.
I totally agree with that. And I would also add that not only have we devalued those things, we've lost sight of how powerful they can really be.
Yes, exactly. And to point out from Nina's perspective, we need both. We need all of it to find that harmony between things like productivity and rest. Right now, we're running ourselves ragged, thinking we have to be busy all the time, right? I'm busy.
Yes. Oh my gosh. It's so true. And she's so good about this. So I was also thinking about this notion of nature as sacred, which really struck me. It's something you see in a lot of Indigenous belief systems, but it seems like it's been really decentered in more mainstream Western religions. And that's really been to our detriment.
Yeah. And there's this quote that I love that really speaks to what you're saying. Man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, unaware that this nature he's destroying is this God he's worshiping.
I've heard that before, but it gives me chills every time because it's so very true. I think no matter what beliefs you hold, or if you aren't religious at all, integrating the natural world into that belief system is really a worthwhile practice.
Absolutely. So we hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. We cannot recommend Nina's book highly enough. And it's linked in the show notes. And I guess we'll talk soon, Jen.
Okay, Monica. See you soon.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.